April 2018. In this newsletter, I explain something that erudite scholars have long debated. What is the significance of the Old Testament appellation All Israel? That is, what does it mean? Why did the prophets use it to refer to the northern kingdom after the division of the kingdom following the death of Solomon? Why do some translations infer the Apostle Paul uses it in Romans chapter 9, verse 6? I told you that if you have read Not all Israel is Israel, you should already know what Paul means by what he says in that passage. He knows the promise was handed down from one heir of the promise to the next until it came into the possession of Jacob. He also knows, all Israel, is how the prophets referred to corporate Israel. That is, they refer to the sons of Israel as if they were all one person. A little later on in the book of Romans, Paul makes it clear he knows the significance of the phrase all Israel. But I told you that those with eyes that cannot see, and ears that cannot hear, won't have a clue as to what he meant by what he said, because the truth regarding their situation is exactly as Paul describes it in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 2 through 6. I gave you a paraphrase of what Paul says in Romans chapter 11, verses 1 through 32, to show you a bit of his mindset regarding Jesus Christ as the remnant of corporate Israel, who continued to hold title to the promise after all the other Jews were cut off from corporate Israel. I told you Paul begins talking about the fact that the Jews have been cut off from corporate Israel, but he insists that does not mean God has abandoned his intention to fulfill the promise. It just means the Jews who rejected the truth are no longer members of corporate Israel, the heir of the promise who has already inherited what was promised. He points back to the fact that the promise was handed down by Abraham to Isaac, and Isaac to Jacob, in accordance with God's choice. In both cases, God rejected a potential heir, Ishmael and Esau, who did not inherit the promise. His point is, the same thing has happened to the Jews. I explained the essence of what Paul says is, God has the right to choose who does and does not have access to the promise. But he mentions what Hosea says about the Gentiles becoming the people of God, because Hosea prophesied at the time when God cut off the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, from corporate Israel, and never restored them. Paul's point is, that same cutting off process resulted in Jesus remaining as the remnant of corporate Israel, and God is now building a house on the very stone that the Jewish leaders ignorantly thought they were cutting off from Israel. I told you that, in Romans chapter 10, Paul expresses his desire that the Jews who have been cut off from corporate Israel would believe that Jesus Christ is the heir of the promise, and accept God's declaration of not guilty, by believing God has fulfilled the promise by raising Christ from the dead. Unfortunately, the Jews have refused to do that, so God turned to the Gentiles and is now taking a people for himself, and building a house out of those who respond to the truth. I told you the biblical account regarding the fullness of the Gentiles begins in Genesis chapter 48, where Jacob, the heir of the promise, was on his deathbed, ready to hand down the promise to the next heir of the promise. Moses tells us that Jacob passed over his eldest sons and gave his grandson Ephraim the honor of carrying the name of the 3 men who had most recently been the heir of the promise. Genesis chapter 48, verses 1 through 22. I explained that Genesis chapter 48 is a pivotal point in the biblical history of the promise, and it provides critical insight into why God granted Gentiles the opportunity to be grafted into corporate Israel. But I also said to understand the biblical history pertaining to the salvation of the Gentiles, one needs to know a few crucial facts about the ancient Hebrew mindset regarding the names of the patriarchs that Jacob gave Ephraim the honor of carrying. So I gave you this list. 1. The name of a man was considered to be an integral part of the man, just as real a part as his body, soul, and spirit. It reflected the essence of who he was. That is why God changed the name of Abram to Abraham, and the name of Jacob to Israel. 2. The ancients believed that, when a man died, he had no hope of resurrection if his name did not have a house, a son in which it could continue living. That is the unstated point of the story about Tamar and Judah in Genesis chapter 38, and the story about Ruth and Boaz in the book of Ruth, as well as the law regarding levirate marriage in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. 3. The son who had the honor of carrying the name of his forefathers was the carrier. Since the resurrection and eternal life of the forefathers depended on someone carrying their name, having a son who could carry it after his death was essential. I told you the fact that Jacob gave Ephraim the right to carry the names of the patriarchs became extremely significant in 722 BC, when the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were cut off from corporate Israel at the time of the Assyrian captivity. The tribe of Ephraim was one of those 10 tribes, and Hosea plainly tells us the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were scattered throughout the Gentiles, when Ephraim got himself all mixed up with them. Hosea chapter 7, verse 8. I said that, when Paul used the phrase the fullness of the Gentiles, in Romans chapter 11, verse 25, he is pointing back to what Jacob said to Joseph, but I also told you he uses the phrase all Israel in the very next verse, because he knows it means corporate Israel. So I went on to explain how God used the covenant ratified at Mount Sinai, to mold the sons of Israel into corporate Israel, the firstborn Son of God that Jesus Christ became when he was baptized by John.